Continue this journey. Let's begin with just a brief moment to bow before God, if you wish, our hearts at least. Gracious God, how we thank you for this treasured gift you have given to us in this book we call the Bible. And this journey that we have been on, looking at how involved the process has been to give us this gift. So as we continue this journey, bless us with a sense of your presence, your wisdom, your insight. In the name of Jesus the Christ, who makes the difference in our lives every single day. Amen. So we have about 3 or 4 more classes. We begin today this process called the canonical process. Talk a little bit about that. Next week we'll look at a lot of the pieces that didn't make it. We'll just slightly review those pieces we've already talked about that didn't make it into the First Testament, but we will spend most of the time looking at this voluminous amount of material that didn't make it into the Second Testament or the New Testament, as most of us refer to it most of the time. And then we will look at how we got the English translations, and you would think that's relatively simple. We just simply talk about 1611 and King James, and no, it's a little bit more involved than that. And then we get into all of the modern translations, and finally we will come back to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's what's left before us. I hope that we will finish on the weekend of the 4th of July, whatever Sunday that is, okay? So we begin today looking at the canonical process. The word canon from the Hebrew means rule or norm. That's kana is the reed or cane, and then from the Greek it is rule or norm, and that is the word kanon. Kane and kanon. I know you'll remember those, right? But essentially, think of the word rule or standard or norm, because that's what we're talking about. So the Bible becomes essentially our standard, for living, for life, if you wish. It is the standard material that has been accepted and recognized as sacred and holy. So how did they get that way? The process is quite involved. This series of actions over a long period of time for essentially over 800 years. For when we start thinking about the First Testament, we're talking about 400 years BCE, when the pieces are beginning to be collected together and put into something that is considered sacred and holy and revered. And we don't finish the Second Testament until about 400 CE, as you will see today. So it's quite an involved process, but it's about where all the material is gathered and so forth. So for the Jews, it is the First Testament, or what they call the Tanakh. And again, that's an acronym for the Torah, the Ketuvim, the writings, if you wish, and the Nephim is the middle one for the prophets. And for the Christians, it's the First and the Second Testament, and so it's that whole 800-year process, essentially. These actions obviously did nothing to make the material sacred or holy or worthy. It was considered sacred or worthy before it was put into this piece we call the Bible, or added to the canon, or the standard for our life and living. The First Testament, the Tanakh, is based on the testimony of the prophetess Huldah. Remember that story? I mentioned it last week. It is essentially King Josiah at the end of the Assyrian Empire. In fact, during the waning years of the Assyrian Empire. So essentially the end of the 7th century BCE, when King Josiah is king of Judah. Remember, the Assyrians have taken the northern kingdom tribes essentially away. They no longer exist. They did that approximately 100 years before Josiah in the south, who is king of Judah. But Judah still retains some of its independence, though it must be paying tribute to the Assyrians. But it is also at the time of the rise of the Babylonians. And Josiah is one of the best kings that Judah had in its whole history. When the two nations split, or the tribes split, 10 went to the north and 2 stayed in the south, essentially. Judah being the dominant tribe, Benjamin also being part of that as well, to form the nation called Judah. And Josiah is one of the best kings. Josiah is a righteous man, a man who really believes in God. And the temple before his time has been somewhat ignored. And so we asked Hilkiah, the high priest, to oversee some cleaning of the temple, at least, if not some basic renovations. And in the process, Hilkiah, the priest, finds the book, which was probably, again, the D. Remember, there are 4 sources, J, E, D, P, and others probably, but this is probably the D source, maybe some of the P source that forms this book that Hilkiah finds in the temple, reads, and says, man, the king needs to see this. He needs to read this. So he takes it to the king's secretary. The secretary reads it and said, yeah, you're right. We need to give this to the king, and the king reads it. But he says, I want to make sure this is authentic. And so he asks Hilkiah to check with Huldah, the prophetess at that time. Now, you and I usually think of Amos, Hosea, Isaiah. Those are the key prophets. But there were, again, in Jewish tradition, there are 7 prophetesses, to include Sarah, and we went through those last week, But this is Huldah, who is the prophet at the time. And they check it out with her, and she said, yes, the king is going to be blessed because he has paid attention to this material, and it should be read by others. So she authenticates that portion, and that's the first authentication that we have within the scripture itself, to the value and the merit of the D source and possibly the P source, pieces of the law. Then we have the testimony of the Septuagint. Now, remember that in the Greek period of time, so we've gone from Sumerian, the ancient Assyrian, the ancient Babylonian. We've come all the way to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We've come to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the one who exiled the people in Judah in 596 and 586 BCE. And then we come to the Persian period, and Cyrus issuing his decree that allows them to go back, and that period is followed by the Greeks. Alexander the Great builds this great library in the city of Alexandria, and that's going to be a key city for the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church from that point on. But then when Alexander the Great dies, the kingdom is split up between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies get Egypt, essentially, most of that Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula area, while the Seleucids get the Syrian piece and the Mesopotamian piece of the empire. But it is Ptolemy II, so out of the Alexandria, the Egyptian influence, Ptolemy II that wants the scriptures and other texts translated from Hebrew or their original languages into Greek. And so that starts in 285 BCE, and then that Septuagint means 70. It may be as many as 72 individuals who worked on these translations over a long period of time. So the Septuagint isn't finished until about 150, and it will include some of the Deuterocanonical. The word Deutero means second or second canon. This is pieces that doesn't eventually fall into the first canon, which we call the Bible. So That's just a word that scholars use to label these pieces of material. Then there is the testimony of Jesus. If you remember in his life in Luke chapter 4, verse 21, he's made a visit to the synagogue, and he's opened the scroll, and the scroll opens to Isaiah chapter 61. And he reads this text about the one who has been called to set the captives free, to care for the oppressed, and so forth. It's a direct quote from Isaiah chapter 61, and Jesus folds up the scroll and says, "Today this text has been fulfilled in your hearing." Okay? So there's an affirmation of this piece from Isaiah. And then you get to chapter 24 and verse 44, where Jesus makes reference to much of the First Testament. He talks about the law, the prophets, and the writings. And so he makes a reference to these pieces as being sacred in his day. When we get to the verse in Thessalonians that talks about all Scripture is inspired, again, I remind you that we're talking about the First Testament. So there too is another reference as well. The testimony of Philo, of Alexander Philo, is a Greek thinker, a philosopher, who combines essentially Stoicism, but Greek philosophy with Judaism. And he and another man, Josephus, I'm going to talk about in just a few moments, consider the First Testament as it makes its way into the first century as divinely inspired. Okay, so Philo is important to us for that reason. Other testimony from the Second Testament, quotations from that of Acts chapter 2. You remember Peter quotes directly from Joel. He's trying to convince the crowd because of the spontaneous speaking in different languages and the tongues of fire and that whole mysterious, majestical moment called Pentecost. And the people think that the disciples are drunk. And he said, no, this is in direct fulfillment of Joel chapter 2, essentially. He quotes from that text. And there are 282 other references in the Second Testament or the New Testament from the First Testament. So we have these witnesses affirming that this material is sacred and worthy to be in the Bible. And there is no reference in the Second Testament to pieces from the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical issues. So that's going to be important as the Second Testament is finally confirmed and put into place. The early testament of Josephus. This is the man I was talking about a moment ago when I talked about Philo. Here's an interesting thing, and this man is really important to us, his writings, and I'm going to reference a couple of them in just a moment. This man is really important to us as we think about understanding the context of the first century. Josephus was a Jew. He was a commander from the Galilean portion of the army in the Jewish-Roman War. And when the Jews were defeated and the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, ironically, he becomes a friend of Vespasian, who was the commander who conquered the Jews in the war, and he eventually became the emperor after the destruction of the temple. He and Vespasian become friends. And eventually, under Vespasian's son, he will become a Roman citizen. And he writes Antiquities of the Jews, and he writes essentially a piece of material called the Jewish War, simply. So he gives us a huge historical context for much of the writings that we find in the Second Testament, because most of it was written after the destruction of the temple, with the exception of the letters of Paul, which probably occurred as early as 50, maybe, probably 55 CE and a little later, and the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. So Josephus is an important figure for us and gives us several documents, and one other I'm going to quote from is Against Appian, or Contra Appian. You may find it as well. And you can read these pieces. They're online. All you have to do is look up Josephus, and you can go and look these pieces up and read them. This comes from the first section of Appian, and kind of the 8th part of that section. For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have. I don't know what all he's referencing there, but Greek material, but only 22 books which contain the records of the past times and are justly believed to be divine. 5 books belong to Moses, so the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. 13 from the prophets, and 4 hymns, or the writings, in other words, and precepts. Okay? There I go again, using that word, okay. That 22 became eventually 24, the Torah, the 5 books, the prophets, 8 books, and the writings, 11 books, adding Ruth and Lamentations that were mentioned, that were missing from the writings of Josephus. And then that 24 eventually becomes our 39, which means the Pentateuch, again, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, or the Torah for the Jews. The history pieces, which would include Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Samuels, and so forth. The prophets, Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, so forth. And the writings, that would be Lamentations, that would be Proverbs, and it would include eventually Jonah, Ruth, and others probably. But the Apocrypha and the Deuterocanonical material was not given the same authority by Josephus and others, because, in his words, there has not been an exact succession of prophets, meaning or documents or authentication. There just isn't the evidence that those belong in the sacred documents for Josephus. Okay. Other testimonies, the Deuterocanonicals, though they may not have been considered sacred by Josephus, still have references to those pieces that are in our Bible today, to the law and to the prophets particularly. The Council of Jamnia may have happened, may not have happened. There's a lot of debate. Some scholars believe it did happen, others don't think it ever did. If it did, it was a council of rabbis, probably somewhere around, or the people, remember the Sanhedrin is the one, part of the Sanhedrin at least, that tried Jesus in the middle of the night. This is the Jewish Supreme Court. We talked a little about them about 3 classes ago, just as one of the groups that evolved during this period of time. So maybe the Sanhedrin met some 20 years after the destruction of the temple, trying to determine which of its scriptures are really sacred and belong in their sacred texts. Supposedly they recognized 22 of the 39 titles if they actually met. But they too rejected the Apocrypha and the Deuterocanonical material. Then we have the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, by the way, does include pieces of the Apocrypha and pieces of the Deuterocanonicals. And all of this just suggests, if we went around this room and said, Paul, what do you believe? And we said, Janet, what do you believe? And we said, Shirley, what do you believe? We're going to get 3 different opinions, aren't we? We're going to get 3 different perspectives. Oh, that's what's happening in the 1st century. There are just all of these different perspectives and conclusions about what belongs and what doesn't. And the Qumran Valley, the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the Qumran community, and we'll talk about in the last class, simply evidence this diversity of thinking in the first century. We think it's unique to us. That's why we have the Methodists and the Lutherans, and we have the Disciples, and we have the Independent Christian Church, and we have the Church of Christ, and we have the Baptists, and we think it's unique to us. It isn't unique at all. First century was very much this way. It wasn't, we tend to think that when Jesus died, there was this little Christian community that evolved that was somehow just cloned. And it wasn't that way at all. It was just all of these different groups, the Essenes and others that evolved during this period of time. So the Tanakh, or the First Testament, is the work of scribes, prophets, teachers, assembled by rabbis, probably not necessarily that Sanhedrin group that met, and then authenticated by use over time. So let's turn to the Second Testament. What are the witnesses there? Well, we need to talk about 5 different periods. The first period is going to be the last half of the first century, because the earliest pieces are written by Paul as letters around, again, starting around Galatians, 1 Thessalonians 55 CE, maybe 53 CE. And then they were copied and disseminated later on, among others. Galatians was intended to be disseminated because that's not just to a church, it is to a group of churches in the province called Galatia. So, they were just simply copied and passed along among faithful people. Letter by Clement of Rome. Okay, before I talk about Clement of Rome, let me just simply refer to a couple of others that I want to just mention. There's some non-Christian evidence to the Second Testament. Again, I've talked about Josephus, but he also references Jesus' crucifixion. I was talking about Josephus against the First Testament. Now I want to talk about the Second Testament and what Josephus said. He makes mention of Jesus' crucifixion in his history and the imprisonment and death of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. The Roman magistrate that I'll talk about here in just a moment, and then I'll come back to Clement of Rome. Let me get down here. Pliny the Younger wrote around 112 CE that Christians meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to God, and bind themselves by oath not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. Then around 4 or 5 years later, Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian, wrote about how Nero tortured Christians and further explained that Christus had suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, who followed after Vespasian, who preceded Vespasian, obviously, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. Then we have another reference that comes that really belongs maybe in the third, and probably does, the third period. Lucian of Samosata, it's Syria, a Syrian satirist, around 170 CE probably, but could have been earlier. The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time. Worship the crucified sage, meaning Jesus, and live after his laws or his teachings. And there are even possible references, though the rabbis debate that, in the Talmud, which probably dates to around 200 CE. So these are these external pieces. But now let me go back and talk about Clement of Rome, who essentially is the fourth bishop of Rome, or the Pope, if you wish. Peter would be the first pope. In 95 CE to the church in Corinth over disputes and leadership. So that which Paul has addressed in his letter to the church at Corinth is still going on. Is it Apollos or is it Paul? Who are we supposed to follow? And there was there were many other issues that divided the people in the church that they disagreed on as you read the letter to Corinthians, to the Corinthians. So here, Clement of Rome, some 40 years later, is writing about the same issue. It's still going on in the church at Corinth. But he makes reference to Matthew, Luke, Hebrews, 1 Timothy, Titus, 1 Peter, and Ephesians. Then when you get down to these external pieces, you'll see other references. This fragment of John, which was found, is the oldest piece that we have, and it's just a very small little fragment that has been found and kept. The early church are the apostolic fathers. Okay, they're called apostolic fathers because they follow the apostles, and their writings are considered significant. In fact, some of the writing is considered sacred enough as to belong into the Bible. They were written by Clement of Rome. That would be First Clement. They were written by Polycarp. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, and he was an early church leader. He was probably the last person to have any direct contact with the apostles. He was a disciple of John. He was a student, in other words, of John. So he had that association. And he resisted Gnosticism, which we'll talk about more next week. Gnosticism essentially said that God is too good to have created the universe because the universe is matter and matter is evil and so forth. And Jesus couldn't have been divine, so he was only a phantom. Okay, he couldn't have been human, rather, because that would be material, and he was divine, so he couldn't be human. So, this is part of the asceticism, and salvation comes through intellectual knowledge and insight and understanding. So anyway, Polycarp writes against that. Ignatius is little known. There's not a lot known about his life, but his writing is important to us. And his correspondence with others from about 110 to 115 CE, he references the Gospels and incorporates languages from the language from a number of the Pauline letters. Justin Martyr describes early worship services and puts apostolic writings on a par with the First Testament, or the Old Testament, as we call it. The Didache is an anonymous piece of material that some still believe should belong in the Scriptures. It essentially is a lot like Matthew, but it is called the teaching of the 12. It's instruction. Didache means teaching and instruction. It's late 1st or 2nd century, so it too evidences the Second Testament. Then we get into the third period where some of the material I just referenced may belong. Irenaeus is another individual. He's the Bishop of Lyons. And remember, this is the Catholic Church in the early days, in the sense of universal in its best sense. We're not talking Roman Catholic. We're talking Catholic in the broad category and sense of the word. But this is the Catholic Church, and the structure is very similar to what we see in the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church, where you have bishops or the Pope, and you have bishops of each of the communities, and you have archbishops and so forth. That structure, church organization. In fact, the Didache talked a little bit about church structure and organization, as well as things like you would find in Matthew. Irenaeus is this bishop who is a student of Polycarp, and again, Polycarp was probably the last person to have a relationship with the apostles. And he quotes from almost all of what we find in the Second Testament. So here's an important witness for us too, although we don't know much about him. Tatian is an Assyrian church leader who made a harmony of the four Gospels called the Diatessaron. Dates to about 170 CE. And then you have the Moratorian fragment. It's named after Father Moratori, who found this piece sometime around 1740. and it's in the Ambrosian Library today in Milan. And a famous historian, Italian historian. Though pieces are missing from his document, probably dates to about 170 CE and includes Luke, John, cites pieces from Acts, 13 letters, minus Hebrews, James, and Peter. So all of Paul's material, and the pastoral epistles, which are today debated as belonging to Paul. Jude, 1st and 2nd John, and Revelation. That's important because you'll see people are discussing those pieces later on. Plus, he said, we accept only the Apocalypse of John and Peter. Well, you say, wait a minute, we only have the Apocalypse of John. It's called Revelation. Well, next week when I show you all these pieces, there are about 12 to 24 pieces of apocalyptic material that are related to the First Testament, and the Apocalypse of Peter is one of them. Still, people didn't want it read in the church because of its mystery and its visionary language. Then there's the old Syriac translation of the scriptures called the Peshitta, all but 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Revelation. This is a 2nd century piece, and probably a lot of the work of Tatian that we just mentioned, an early Assyrian church leader. Then you get to the 4th period, and you get to a man named Origen. He's a scholar. Exegete, we mean he takes the scripture, he takes it apart and studies the language, the history. He tries to get the best definition. That's an exegetical. Most clergy are accused of being eisegist, which means we read into the text what we want it to mean. Most of us do that to some extent, right? Yeah. Well, exegetical means you try to do as true and honest a piece as you can. And so Origen is a scholar and an exegete. He wrote commentaries and homilies on most of the Second Testament and emphasized their divine inspiration. And again, how you define that? Do you mean divine influence? Do you mean dictated? Probably not. Divine inspiration for Origen was probably that God inspired this material, gave the writer the impetus to write using his own context and situation, or her, but probably his. Dionysius of Alexandria, we don't know the exact time this man was born, but he died around 264 CE. He was the 14th Pope of Alexandria. This is going to become the Eastern Church eventually. He questioned material from Hebrews up to, in other words, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, Jude. He questioned those pieces, but Revelation he accepted, interestingly enough. So there's this debate going on, essentially, and we're getting close to the end of the 3rd century. Okay, now we're at the 4th century. The bishop of Caesarea, Eusebius, authored a church history noting the universal acceptance of the 4 Gospels, Acts, letters of Paul, and Hebrews, 1 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation, James, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude were included, but still questioned, as he notes, by some people in his day. The Acts of Paul and the Didache were excluded. These are other pieces that will eventually be, that we'll talk about, that are deuterocanonical for the Second Testament. Constantine becomes emperor and things change significantly because he has something of a conversion experience to Christianity, but the most important thing is he issues an edict that allows Christianity to be recognized as legal and appropriate and and he even asks that the divine scriptures be translated and distributed among the people, copied. The Council of Laodicea, this is again this Catholic Church as it's spread across the empire. It's coming from all sorts of pockets, from Alexandria in Egypt. It's coming from the Galatian portion of Asia Minor. It's coming from Rome. It's coming from all over. So they meet together. These leaders, these bishops from Lyon, Smyrna that I've already referenced, they're all meeting together. And they listed all but Revelation and asked that they be read from the pulpit. Revelation is still a little strange. Bishop Athanasius, this is the man I've referenced once before, but I'm sure you may have forgotten. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, in his Easter letter, I think, in fact, I said off the cuff that Sunday morning, I mentioned it, the Christmas letter. It's an Easter letter of 367 CE, specified the 27 books that we have in our New Testament today without any qualifications, and they were to all be read in worship. This is the first documentation or evidence or witness to all 27 as we have them in our New Testament today, or the Second Testament. And then Jerome translates the Vulgate, or that's the Latin translation, from the Hebrew Tanakh and the Septuagint. He has 46 First Testament books, so he includes part of the Apocrypha, and the 27 Second Testament books. So here again, as a later affirmation by an individual, Augustine, who becomes Bishop of Hippo, included all of the disputed First Testament books following the order of the Septuagint. So his is more than at least the 46. Developed the concept of the original sin. And by original sin, it just means everyone is born sinful. This means that we all have been, we've got a piece of Adam's DNA, if you wish. And we've all been born with that character, that disposition to do bad things and disobey God. It is the gift that we've been given from the first people. Okay, so that's original sin. The just war theory. There are 4 or 5 pieces of war. You go, is war ever just? Is that really godly? Well, that's a good question. But per Augustine, there were reasons for the good of the betterment of all. And sometimes you have to do things like Hitler. You have to take on a Hitler. You have to stop. Who was the guy in Africa some years ago, and several since, and the genocide. You have to stop that some way. You have to intercede. So for Augustine, there were just reasons for going to war. Still a good debate. And the church is the gift of God or the city of God. That's a book, by the way, that he wrote. And it is a defense, as this next statement says. Apologist simply means they're not apologizing for their faith, they are defending the faith. Okay, so apology is misleading, but they were an apologist. And an author who defended the Bible and the church and the city of God, probably using the Latin Vulgate as he was translating it. And then there is the Council of Carthage, 397. This is the official recognition, the first official large group recognition of the New Testament as we have it today, the 27 pieces or books that we have in our Second Testament. The basic criteria that they used, first, it had to be Christocentric. And that, now we're talking just the Second Testament, just the 27 books. It had to be Christocentric, okay? Centered in Jesus, centered in Christ. Again, Christ is a title. Jesus is the person. Make that distinction when you are reading through the scriptures. Apostolic origin, that there was at least some connection to the apostles, like even the writings of Polycarp later on, who was an associate of John. So there had to be some apostolic connection. Paul considered himself an apostle, remember, because of that revelation he had on the road to Damascus, that majestical moment where the light comes shining out and he hears the voice of Jesus speaking to him. Consistency with previous revelation and doctrine. So there has to be a consistent thread that flows through this. Even though there may be differences in the accounts, there has to be a certain element of consistency with the documents. Acceptance and use, this is very important, by the early church, and that's why I just tracked through all the material we just went through. You could see how this was evolving, how it came together, and certainly by the early church leaders or fathers. I've taught a class some 8 or 9 years ago on the Apostolic Fathers, and there are essentially you can refer to 11 of them if you include the Didache written by an anonymous author. The external influences, the challenges by a person like Marcion. Marcion was a Gnostic, a Syrian Gnostic, and he questioned that. He said a good God couldn't have created the universe because the universe is material and it's evil and so forth, and Jesus had to be a phantom because he couldn't be a human being, and so forth. There's some strange things. So those challenges made the people think through the material they were going to include into the Second Testament. Political persecutions like that of Diocletian before the Edict of that I just referenced, that gave permission to the Christians to exist. Before Constantine, there was Diocletian, and he was really against Christianity and the movement, and it was a pretty heavy time of persecution. It was even illegal to own any of the scripture pieces that were being collected or material, what we call the Bible, First Testament or Second. So it was a difficult time. So the church evolves from that kind of persecution as well. Pieces that are still questioned and questioned over time, James, because Luther had a problem here, because for him, justification by faith was the theme that he extracted from his study of Romans, and that was really the piece that led to the Protestant Reformation, that we are justified by faith, not by Roman Catholic pieces of paper that you bought to buy the pardon for the sins of your family who died before you, and really it was to raise money and build new cathedrals. Luther just had lots of problems with that, but he said it's not a matter of what the Pope says or what the bishop says, it's about a matter of faith, individual as well as community faith. It's a collective thing. So he questioned James. 2 Peter and Hebrews, primarily because the precise author is unknown, but it's mainly because each lacks use by the early church. There's no evidence that they were used. 2nd and 3rd John for the same reason, but also because they seem short and personal and not necessarily addressed to the community of the faith, just individuals. Revelation, well, simply because it is strange and obscure. Now we're talking at least after the 4th century. In the 1st century, that language wouldn't have been strange and obscure, but over time it begins to be more mysterious and questioned as to whether it should belong. Okay? Okay. You caught me. Now, we have a little time for questions. Yes?
I'm curious, were there a lot of people in that area that spoke and read Greek? It's translated from Hebrew into Greek for some reason, but there was a lot of languages around in that area.
Aramaic was probably the most common spoken language in the 1st century. But certainly with the Eastern Church, you're talking Greek would be very, very familiar because we're talking about the Greek influence in Alexandria. Were there very many people who could read these texts? No. These would be very well trained people, the scribes, the rabbis, the people who've had the privilege of being trained. But it was beginning to increase. So that's like we talked about last week, because the apostles were beginning to disappear, the material became. The question was, were there very many? I've got to repeat that because it's being videoed. The question was, were there very many people who spoke only one language, and the scriptures were being translated into various versions. You already had Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic pieces. And now you're having them translated into Syriac and so forth, many other.
One other question.
Yeah.
There's 39 books in the Old Testament. 3 times 9 is 27, and 27 books in the New Testament, which equals 66. Do you think numerology had anything to do with them?
No, there are 39 pieces in our First Testament. There are 27 in our Second Testament, 66 altogether. Do I think there's any influence of numerology in that decision of what went into the Bible? Maybe thinking of Revelation and 666? No, I don't think there's any relevance to that at all. I think it just turns, because in the Hebrew count, that isn't the number anyway, in the Tanakh. 39 is not their number. 24 would be their number. Say again?
The Eastern Orthodox doesn't have the same number either, does it?
No, the Eastern Orthodox has all of the Apocrypha. The Roman Catholic Church accepts 7 of the Apocrypha. So, yeah, it isn't the same for the Roman Catholic. Good point. So I don't think numerology has anything to do with it. Good question, though. Great thought. I hadn't even gone there. Other stretches to my thin mind? God's blessings. I'll see you next week. You're going to be, perhaps, if you haven't looked at this, you'll be a little surprised at the volume of material that didn't end up in our Bible. And some for very good reason. Okay? We'll do that next week. God bless.